This morning, we're going to begin with a panel discussion about knowledge mobilization and the science policy interface. So the panel today will be moderated by Vivian Nguyen from Carleton University. And the session will feature panelists including Darren Porter, who is a fisher from the Bay of Fundy and will be joining us virtually on the screen in a moment there. Rafid Shidqi from the Thresher shark, Indonesia. Kerstin Forsberg from Planeta, Océano and MigraMar, and Jayne Gardiner from New College, Florida. So over the next hour or so, they'll be discussing tangible examples of how aquatic telemetry research and telemetry data can be used to support decision-making and improve understanding of social, economic, and environmental issues. So with that, I'm very pleased to turn it over to Vivian to moderate the session.
Thank you. Can everyone hear me okay? Awesome. So good morning, everyone. I was just telling my colleagues here I had too much coffee last night, so I couldn't sleep. And but I am really excited to be here with you today. And disclaimer, I'm actually on mat leave, so I left my 5-month-old home. I couldn't pass up the opportunity to join everyone and engage with such a thoughtful community, which I've had the privilege to be a part of. I think during my master's almost 13 years ago as an HQP. So it's a bit different to be here in a different role. So my grad research was actually really focused on mobilizing telemetry derived knowledge into action. So action can be change in policy, change in practice, change in behavior, or even just social acceptance of what you're doing in your research. And so this topic is really, it's very near and dear to my heart, and I'm very excited to be engaging with our panelists today. Before we do get started, I was asked to say a few words on the theme of science in society. So the theme of science in society, or that thinking around that, really took off around the 1990s when there were two publications, one in Nature and one in Science, one from Dr. Jayne, a marine scientist, and then Dr. Michael Gibbons, who's a science policy scholar, where they called out for science and like science's new social contract. So Dr. Jayne, her paper was really about calling out to environmental scientists to commit their energy, their talents to most the pressing issues of today. Whereas Dr. Gibbons' paper was about how we are now producing new modes of knowledge, where before mode one, production of knowledge, is a lot about being in the lab, being the ivory tower, but now it's shifting towards not only does your research have to be reliable, but also socially robust, meaning that the actors, society is more involved. They are scrutinizing a lot of the work that's been done, but if you are involving society or the relevant actors and including some of the non, I guess, academic experts or lay experts, that the knowledge you're producing might be more accepted when applied. So now we are 2 decades later, and yesterday we heard from Albert Marshall asking again that the energy from our science, can that be harnessed to heal Mother Earth? And it's not an easy task. And I think today we're going to hear from the experiences of our panelists, their reflections and lessons learned on how they've done it and what they've experienced, what challenges and potential solutions that we can use to move forward. And I think I don't have to do introductions. We've had that. So let's get started. I really liked what Steve Cook did yesterday, where he kind of paused and then involved the audience. So that's what we're going to do. We have some preset questions for our panelists, but I think I might pause in between so that we can encourage a dialogue with the audience. So science policy, it's very context dependent. So what I want to ask from each panelist to start with is to tell us a bit about your work and how science policy fits in the context of your work, so we can understand where you're coming from and what your perspectives are coming from. I will start with Kerstin.
Thank you very much, Vivian, and it's a real pleasure and honor to be here with you today. So I run a nonprofit called Planeta Océano in Peru, And our work is focused precisely on that, on empowering coastal communities and engaging coastal communities in marine conservation. And I'm just going to tell you a bit about the story and how we got there. This is actually a nonprofit that I started in 2007, just straight after undergrad school. So I was 22 years old, and I started this sea turtle project and engaging communities to monitor sea turtles. And the work that we did not only engaged over 100 local volunteers at the time and local community members and fishers, but it was also used to, for example, support red listing for sea turtles in the country, or used in reports and governmental reports for international commissions. I then moved on, and because we were seeing a lot of strandings of sea turtles at that time, I was thinking, how much are sea turtles being talked about in schools, for example? How much is the ocean talked about in schools? So we reached out to schools. We formed this network called the Marine Educators Network that has over 50 schools, and started working on ocean literacy. And from there, I've been really fortunate, for example, to work with UNESCO in developing the ocean literacy framework for the decade. And now I'm really excited that UNESCO has actually committed to engage marine education globally in its member states up to 2025. That's the kind of the target. But more recently, I think that examples that kind of like are really relevant at our event today is our manta ray conservation project and our sawfish conservation project. And so we started working with fishermen to understand giant mantas, which at the time were not legally protected, and to kind of map out the distribution of giant mantas in northern Peru. And based on that, build relationships with the government to get manta legally protected, and recently also critically endangered sawfish legally protected. So I think that my work and how it relates is we're right there at that interface of science to policy, but really having community members at the forefront and making sure that communities have a voice in developing this science and this policy, and that policy at the end is also relevant to their own development.
Thank you. Darren, can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you.
Can I go to you next?
Yep. I was a fisher years ago. I recognized a major issue as we didn't have a voice at the table. There's no legislative voice. There was no place for us in academic spheres. There was no. It seemed like our knowledge was not only not understood. It wasn't being used because it wasn't even being asked for. And I used to read studies a lot. I still do. And in the studies, they would conflict with what I understood and what my fellow fishers understand as I'm a spokesman for the fishery. And they didn't just conflict, they were completely different. And then I realized quickly the difference was that we cared about the content versus the product, which to me we need to figure out how to increase the content in the academic product, which was the papers being written, to increase the acceptance and or eliminate conflict between our groups. So I spent the last decade and a half to 2 decades trying to understand the academic system and other systems like traditional knowledge and other systems, as well as my own. So I guess from my point of view is my quest or goal that brought me to this room today was trying to figure out how to bridge those gaps.
Thank you. Rafid.
Yeah, thank you. Can everyone hear me? Yeah. First of all, I think pleasure to be here. Thanks for OTN for bringing me back. I fly from Indonesia, so it's almost 2 days flight. It's very exhausting. But yeah, first time in Halifax was in 2020, a few weeks before COVID lockdown. I did my master's at the University of California in Santa Cruz. I did my master on coastal science and policy. So it's exactly how I think the program was meant to develop a science approach that actually could be applied for changing policies and practice for the community, especially in Indonesia. So I've been working with primarily on sharks and rays. I think a little bit the same with Kerstin. I work with manta at first. So in a community where people are hunting them, so they do a traditional harpoon, and they've been doing that practice for hundreds of years. And then my work back then was just an intern, and then trying to understand what is actually the motivations of people harpooning the manta rays. And in 2014, actually, the Indonesian government kind of implementing the national ban for manta ray because they've already endangered. Some of them have already disappeared from some places, and it creates like a huge backlash and all that. And it was kind of like an inspiring work for me because I get to understand the dynamics between the marine biology, conservation, and also the community. And then I started, I think it's kind of a privilege because from then I got exposed by the acoustic telemetry and the satellites to understand the movement of manta ray, especially within the marine protected area, and then use that information for conservation and site-based protection and all that. And then I started my own NGO in 2018. I realized that I was just I didn't make that much of impact in my work before, and then I got support to start my own nonprofit called Thresher Indonesia. So it's the village is quite the same, close to where I work with the manta ray community, and the situation is almost the same. Like they hunted treasure sharks, and at first, like I just wanted to understand, like, why are they hunting them? Are they consuming them? Are they exporting the fins because I think the Chinese medicine really make like a huge demand on shark fin soup, and it drives a lot of people, especially local artisanal communities, to hunt sharks and all that. And I think from that it started to develop, and I got supports on the mini-pat satellite tags and acoustics. I think I'll talk a little bit later, but I think the overall goal of our NGO is to really change the situations of shark fishing without necessarily have to sacrifice the rights of the community. So we don't want them to suffer, because we have to limit their catches on the sharks, but at the same time we want them to thrive economically from other types of livelihood that is potentially more sustainable. And telemetry approaches is one way to for us to understand that dynamics in the area. So yeah, glad to be here.
Thank you. And last but not least, Jayne.
Thank you. So I'm at New College of Florida, which, unless for the folks here who know me, maybe know where that is, but probably many of you have otherwise never heard of it. It's an absolutely teeny tiny college. We've only got about 600 students, and we're on the Gulf Coast of Florida. So I spend a lot of time working directly with students. We have a very low student to faculty ratio and really engage with undergraduate students. We're an undergraduate focused institution, engaging them in research. And so I spend a lot of time thinking about, who we're engaging in this scientific discourse and how we're engaging with them. And both as Darren was touching on, sort of not just outputs to community groups, but inputs from those groups as well. Marine science is still one of the least diverse fields. And I think that's something we all acknowledge at this point and want to work on. And we don't always know how to go about that in the best way. So connecting with different groups in the community who are working to further that goal and just continually learning and growing as you're, working towards that goal of engaging more with different groups and doing that in a way that honors and respects everyone's contribution. That's something that came up in yesterday's panel as well. So paying people for their efforts, for example, acknowledging the value of that local ecological knowledge that can be so valuable to the things that we're doing. So that's kind of a big part of what I do. And then if you caught my talk yesterday, you can see that many of the outputs, you can probably guess where these go. For me, working on highly migratory species, that very often the research that I'm doing plugs directly into some of the policy decisions when it comes to managing commercially and recreationally harvested species in the Gulf of Mexico and in Florida waters. So contributing data to stock assessments in particular to that process, everything from abundance data to habitat use. Sometimes you find unexpected opportunities to collect data as well. So that's something I would challenge people to think about. Are there ways you can layer additional things into the things that you're doing and sort of maximize those outputs that can help with decision making? Yeah, lots of different things that I work on, I guess. So yeah.
Perfect. And we'll have an opportunity to unpack some of that.
Sure.
So that's great. So we have such a diverse panel ranging from NGOs, academia, and also local knowledge holder. So thank you, Darren, for being here too. So the next question, so we've been talking about lessons learned throughout the symposium. And the next question here is, I want each panelist to think about or share briefly an example of a research project that utilized acoustic telemetry to help inform science policy. And I said briefly because I really want to focus on, you know, what had to happen in your example for that change to occur. So to think about some of those key lessons, drawing from the example that you'll be discussing, is something I'd like you to maybe think about and share with the audience here. So how about I start with Darren?
Yeah, thank you. I got quite a few projects I've worked on, and I try to work on things I believe in and I feel that will make a difference and potentially change policy, if not even regulations and acts. Example that I'm working on quite hard right now is two projects, Halfway River, Nova Scotia, and as well as Windsor Causeway. These are both construction projects by the province, and they require fish passage. And in order to figure this out, in the past, people just put forward conceptual ideas, and whether they worked or not was here nor there, because there was no way to measure the efficiency and effectiveness of passage, and it wasn't being done very often, if at all, especially in high tidal environments. And where I work, it's the highest tides in the world. High sediment loads, high tides, extremely hard to monitor sites. So we work in, and then also I try to only work on projects that involve Indigenous participation and or knowledge, and academics, as well as our fishery, which is local knowledge. In that way, during the project, we not only get a good product at the end, we have extremely high valued content for the regulator to do a better job during the projects. So we use multiple tagging types from pit tags, acoustics, Floyd tagging. We do mark recapture and stuff like that on either side of these barriers on a constant basis. It's very heavy on the data, which gives the statisticians and the scientists lots of information to work with and put into their models and everything else they've got to do to make them more efficient and better, because we all understand models only as good as the data put into it. So that we also work on, I worked on projects with industry, for Big Moon Tidal, for example. It's a tidal developer that had a low impact device that got along with the locals and the fisheries. So we decided to work with them. We got 40 some receivers, and we tracked fish on our own as fishers. The company came to us and said, "What do you want?" So we found a way to work with them and try to do science from our eyes to try to, as fishermen are very bad traditionally at communicating to the academic system. The academic system is what's in control of our legislative process, as well as our policy and everything else. Fishermen don't have much say in policy or legislation. So we were trying to find a way for to get in the door, because as a local knowledge holder of fishers, there is no section 35 of the Constitution or section 2.3, 2.4 as there is with Indigenous peoples. We don't have a way into the door that is that you must deal with us. There is no way. So we had to find a way to make us fun to play with, I guess, and useful to increase universities production, I guess. So I work on that. I work on white sharks a little bit, acoustically tagging with the American government. Like, I mean, I don't tag them myself, but I do feed my information through, and we've had some pretty amazing stuff. It's not published yet, but it's going to be like very close acoustic tracking within a estuary and or basin situation, which is from their scientists tell me it's probably the closest tracking of how a fish would move within a system for 3 or 4 days up here, which is kind of cool acoustically. I also work with tidal turbines companies, projects. Also, once again, involve First Nations academics and us tagging fish, because we're more suited to capture these fish and tag them than is universities. So yeah, we work on a lot of projects, and these projects all change policy by being involved. We get better information, better content. Better content means better policies and better legislation. That's how I see it.
Thanks, Darren. Do you have a specific example, maybe of a policy or practice that had been changed, and maybe it's a key takeaway from all of the work you've done? What was maybe one thing, if you pick one thing that really drove changes, what would it be?
Just the increase in knowledge, the content. Like, for instance, I get into this because I read a study that caught one eel on the seaward side of a structure done by a university and the very best of the professors that you could imagine. I totally disagree with that. And since, with my involvement and my fisheries involvement, we've actually caught up to 114 eels in 1 hour in the same location that they caught one eel in a year. So simply by way of increasing the content of the data that is used, it has changed. We've got ministerial orders in place now, which is a legislative tool used by DFO versus a letter of advice prior to, whereas there was no proper evidence gathered in order for the government to properly regulate that structure. Now there's a ministerial order in place. There will be, and there is, better fish catches than there has been in the last half decade. That's one example. Another one soon will be Happy River. And another one probably will be tidal power in the end, because the more information and the better content collected means, DFO's already started, which is our regulator in Canada, has already started stiffening up the regulations on, axial flow hydraulic turbines in extremely sensitive migratory corridors into like the Minas Basin where we are, where it's a nursery. So, the fact that a decade ago, Department of Energy was claiming there was only a dozen fish there, and now there's millions being, seen through different technologies, and there's acoustic tracking of at least 7 or 8 species through that passage. We're not only starting to see the sheer numbers of fish that are now being recorded academically, we're starting to see their movements and where they're moving and how frequently. So that's changing the regulatory policies on how they're dealing with that industry. So there's tons of examples. It's just simply by raising the content of the product, meaning raising the quality of the product, or the content within the product, we're changing policy constantly. Even if it's not, our name isn't on it, we are changing the way things are regulated, because you can't manage something if it's not measured. So I guess by increasing the content of the papers, we're creating a sphere where you can measure better, or start to think about measuring the effects of something other than fishers. Because all we currently measure, which is necessary, is the fishery through fisheries landings. We're not measuring the effects of all other users besides fishermen. So all these studies done with acoustics are certainly very important, because we're now being able to watch fish move on a computer in universities and or the regulators' offices. And before, fishermen were just screaming at the door saying you can't do this or whatever, and nobody was being heard because there was no actual data being produced by us besides our knowledge systems, and we are very bad at producing information in a form that's acceptable academically. Does that make sense, or is that too much?
Thanks, Darren. Yes, that's awesome. It sounds like some of the partnership, the collaboration with local fishers is really bringing in more data and quality of data to some of the DFO work. I'm going to move next to Rafid, if you can share an example and some key takeaways.
Yeah, sure. I think, so I'm working with the species, the pelagic thresher shark. If you're not familiar, it's the one with the big eyes and long tails. People in the Philippines call them the gay shark because they don't look like sharks. They're very flamboyant. And yeah, we're working in a marine protected area in of Alor, which is located within the Coral Triangle. If you're familiar, it's one of the most biodiverse marine region in Southeast Asia and the world as well, and has high diversity of sharks. But ironically, I think, like Frida mentioned, like it's a huge MPA. It hosts like 30% of the total MPA in Indonesia, but they're very poorly managed. And even sharks information are not included there. So the MPA that I'm working on, it's around 400,000 hectares. But at the process of developing the MPA, it was not very well informed. Like they don't have where the sharks are moving, and even the information on pelagic thresher shark was just revealed when I started working there. They don't know about sharks before. Like, do we have sharks like this? And then when I show them the pictures and then how the people are fishing them and all that, they started to really pay attention to that key information. And at first, and I think the goal for us to understand the pelagic thresher shark movement within the MPA is to really find out where is the hotspot, or if there's any sign of residency of the species. And even my professor back in my master's, he said like, oh, what if you tag the sharks and then the shark never came back? You will not get any information from that. And we just wanted to prove that. That's why I think that the network of the acoustic is just really small. We only have 8, 2 of them stolen by the fishermen. So we have 6, but I think eventually, like from the 8 receivers that we have, we collaborate with the dive operators because we want to know, like, it's an MPA and the tourism is going on. And one of the example in the Philippines, pelagic thresher shark is the only tourism attraction there that has created revenue for about like 15 million USD per year for a small community in the Philippines. And then we were so inspired, like, what if we create something like this? What if we try to reveal whether tourism would be the viable option for the communities there? And then, we tagged 20 sharks, 7 of them eventually stayed within the MPA. So over the course of 1 year of my study, we see that these 7 is actually just roaming around, and then they continuously being detected in the receivers. And the sad thing is that it's only located 1 kilometer from the fishing spot. So even if it's only 7, 2 of them recaptured after 1 year, got killed. And then it just gave us the information, I think that the population is already really small, and then there's a high residency of the sharks. And if we don't stop the fisheries, it eventually removed them. And I think what I have to mention is that 80% of the sharks are pregnant. So the fishermen could land for about 300, 500 sharks per year, and 80% of them pregnant. So it's almost 1,000 sharks per year within such a small community. And if you don't really stop that, it will really disable the ability for the sharks to recover from the area. And I think that, with that 7 sharks information, 8 receivers, 2 of them stolen, we bring that information to the government. Hey, the sharks that we've been studying, they're staying here. And at the same time, the community is still catching them, and 2 of them see that this is recaptured. We see that the tags is already inside of the sharks, and we get them back. And it really give the government some sort of, they started to see that, and then we bring the example, like, look, in the Philippines, pelagic thresher shark is a flagship species. Like, it could generate millions of dollars from tourism. You already have the MPA, and then you already have a tourism going on. What if you include that pelagic treasure shark as the one flagship species that you could promote and all that? And Indonesia, Alor could be the first region for pelagic treasure shark tourism in Indonesia even, and the second to Philippines. So that's really, I think the idea is like, when it comes to money, the science makes sense, to the government. Like, oh, okay, yeah, if you protect this, you will get, some revenues and money, and then that political will comes in, oh, okay, let's just protect the sharks. And I think that's how our acoustic information helps to kind of really open the eye of the government there to, to see that there's a value side of the of the fisheries.
Yeah, so it's like how you framed it.
Yeah.
It's like, oh, okay, you're gonna attract more tourism.
Yeah.
And things. So, oh, that's awesome.
Yeah, I
Thank
think
you.
I have to add, like, I think interestingly, like with the science, previously, I think that in the presentations, they show the animations of movement within the receiver. And then we use that kind of approach as well. And the government was like, oh yeah, it's like they're like a kid who's just like,
like a hook.
see a very interesting information. And they,
Ball or something.
yeah. Oh, that's really cool. And then, it's really interesting. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. Jayne, can I go to you next?
Sure. So I work on a number of different shark species. My interests largely lie in the ecology of these species and what habitats they're using and why. Environmental correlates that relate to use of nursery habitat, for example. So I do some work in that space. I presented yesterday on, some work on great hammerheads. And I think in setting out to do the work, there were some immediate management needs that we saw that we could plug these data into. But then there were some surprises along the way as well. And I think that's kind of what I'd like to talk about here is just thinking about additional ways that your data can help with management decisions. So I think I have often thought that some of the things that I'm doing, the sample sizes are too small, right? And so those data maybe are not particularly helpful. I anticipated when there's a stock assessment going on right now for great hammerheads, for all hammerheads actually in the US. I anticipated contributing catch data and some length weight data. We had this, sizable data set there, and I certainly did. And then somebody said, well, don't you have movement data? And I thought, I've got 5 animals so far where we have good data. And they said, we have nothing. We need these. So I ended up contributing those data as well. And there were a lot of pieces of, small chunks of information coming together that told a broader story. And so, there's one animal in my data set out of 5 so far that we've observed crossing from the Gulf to the Atlantic. Well, it turns out other people had seen 1 or 2 in their data set. And when you start putting that together, it paints a picture that these animals are going back and forth. And so that was one of the factors that went into the decision to manage those populations as one, rather than separating Gulf and Atlantic, taken along with some genetic information and things as well. But don't be afraid. Don't think what you have as small potatoes. Talk to the folks who are making management decisions. Stay in communication with them. What do they need, especially when they're dealing with data deficient species? You would be surprised at how your data can be helpful.
Great, thank you. And I like how you pointed out that there were multiple lines of evidence that helped. So the movement data was a part of the picture, but then there were other pieces that were brought together. Which
right.
Awesome.
And I think especially when the different pieces are feeling kind of thin, it's when you bring those together, it's the totality of the information is supporting, especially when you have to make a decision. The stock assessment is happening. You have to decide, are we going to do this as one thing or 2 things? And yeah, so talk with your managers, figure out what they need, figure out what you have, and even if it's small, contribute it.
Great, thank you. Kerstin.
Thank you. Well, I'm here kind of wearing 2 hats because I am from Planeta Océano in Peru, but I'm also part of MigraMar, which is a network of researchers across the Eastern Pacific. I think that Frida did a really good job yesterday at explaining how acoustic telemetry has helped in the region for MPAs. And I want to perhaps dive a bit deeper into what the process for us has been in building that conversation with the managers and with the government, because that's a whole process in itself, right? And so when we started working with giant mantas several years ago, we started collecting data and working with fishermen. And then we noticed that there was this big issue, right? Manta rays were legally protected in Ecuador. It was likely that they were migrating into Peru. It was likely one of the largest populations of giant mantas documented in the world. And they were being harvested in Peru. And so we set out and we did a report, and we asked the government to legally protect the species, but we had no answer, right? And so that took like 2 to 3 years for us to really get that. And the kind of the process of that was very diverse. We definitely had several meetings. I think that one thing to consider is kind of recognizing how this fits again in the big picture of the manager. So Peru has the National Action Plan for sharks and rays. So it's kind of like having that conversation of, this is not just this random thing, but it fits within national policies and frameworks that already exist. There is this background information. Then there was this whole process of relationship building and identifying local leaders. So we had the Ministry of Environment that was like, we're going to support you. We're going to, get this on the ground, because we had the fisheries department that we needed to pressure, but we had that, support from the other ministry, the other department of environment. And then one big thing that contributed to the legal protection for giant mantas was definitely public awareness. And so there was a lot of media. We did a lot of media. And there was this huge giant manta that was captured by a fisherman that we now, is very dear to us and works really closely with us. His name is Edgardo, and he had captured this giant manta that was lifted with a crane, and it went out on local media, and people were like, wow, what is that? It's a monster. And so we kind of like reverted that situation, and we were going out on media and talking, this is something that we've been working on for so many years, and we need a response from the government. And the next day I received this call from, the fisheries office saying, we want to work with you. We want to get this legal protection out. So there is this need to get the public engaged, to get the media engaged. And then recently with our other, project in critically endangered large-tooth sawfish, it was kind of the same thing. It's like building those networks, building that network of support of the researchers with the managers, getting that local ecological knowledge out to understand the species, and then kind of recognizing how you can get in the door with the low-hanging fruit. So it was like, in this case, sawfish wasn't a species that people really depended on. It's the same with the giant mantas, for example. We wanted to get the giant mantas and also the mobulas protected, but the smaller mobula species are very much targeted by fishers. So like our entry point was a giant manta. So it's kind of getting that entry point, building those relationships, building yourself upon a context, and just getting the support that you need from partners.
Awesome. Thank you. And I really liked how you touched on the entry point. When I was younger, it was like, how do you even get into this world of policy, and who do I need to meet, and who do I need to talk to? So how about I want to pause right now and give the audience a chance to ask any questions or any of your own reflections on some of your work maybe, or yeah.
I've been asked to state my name again. So my name is Mark Riddell, and I'm still at Fisheries and Oceans. I've actually been a DFO for over 20 years, started on the West Coast and now on the East Coast. And I just want to go back to, Jayne made a very good point, is if you do want to have a meaningful impact to managers, go talk to managers as soon as you can, as opposed to wave your hand saying it's going to have some management implications, because that's often the case. At least I've seen this in many proposals, both within DFO and outside DFO, saying, oh, we're going to have a meaningful impact. But until you engage the managers to ask them, what do you need to know to make a decision? And it's a simple question. You might not always get an answer, but you do have to ask that question. So And it's within DFO, it's not the scientists that you have to talk to. It's not DFO science. It's other management branch like aquaculture management. There's fish protection plan and other managers. So you probably can get in touch with DFO scientists that may be able to hook you up with managers. So that might be one way to talk to them, but just don't be afraid to talk to managers.
Great, thank you. That is great advice.
Over there.
And just a reminder to state your name and where you're from. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Felix Eisenhower from the University of New Brunswick. And I have a question. Like yesterday in the first panel, I think Shelley said that a thing that we can learn from social sciences is to accept that our work is political and that we could learn from that. So now, like a lot of papers that you read about endangered species, like they all agree on that, like overfishing is a big problem. And so should we be more political about our output on that case? And so I guess that's a question for the whole panel. And the question to Darren then would be, if so, if we would do that, do you see that there would be a conflict of interest in our collaborations that we do between scientists and fishers?
Okay, great. So there's a two-part question. Does anyone want to tackle the first question? Or we could go straight to Darren.
I'm not.
Darren, do you want to tackle the question that was addressed to you? Oh.
Sorry, was the second part, whether there's a conflict of interest in the collaborations, the fishers are involved? Is that what that second part was?
Yes, exactly. Especially like
Okay.
if we as
Well-
scientists, like if we accept that we should be more political in our.
That's a great question. So what fishers don't write papers, or very rarely do. I haven't seen too many academic papers that move policy written by fishers. Our involvement is increasing the product content, which means instead of catching one fish, when you're not trained to be a fisherman or fisher person, as an academic student or a DFO person or whoever, they're not fishermen. They're not. They're not a fisherman. So they're outside their own discipline when they're catching marine creatures. I'm a fisherman. So that's my discipline. My discipline isn't writing policy. My discipline isn't writing acts or laws. That is an academic discipline. So all I'm doing is increasing the content of the product, and the product being the paper or the decision at the end of the day. And to increase the product, I would say that is absolutely not a conflict, because we're bringing more clarity to a decision-making process. If you would look at conflict of interest, I would more look at funding and or things like that aren't measured, like all other things that aren't measured besides fishing. So if you look at the blue economy, for example, there's a conflict of interest. If you're not measuring the effect of a work undertaken or activity as is written in the Act, Fisheries Act, which is tidal turbines, wind turbines, offshore, bridges, culverts, everything, aquaculture, the genetic diversity lost due to aquaculture on serralicet species, for example, which is a worldwide well-known effect that's not being measured, I would say that would be your more conflict of interest, although they're not low-hanging fruit as a fisherman is. A fisherman is easy to come after because it's socially acceptable to take the low-hanging fruit and push it down, to blame it because we're the ones measuring our effect. We're the only ones measuring our effect, actually. Recreational fishers don't measure their effect in Canada. In Canada, nobody besides commercial and or Indigenous fishers measure their effect. So I would say no. That would be my answer to the second part, and I did not catch the first part. Sorry.
Do you mind repeating your first question?
Yeah, my first question was like about Shelley's statement yesterday in the first panel, like that that we should accept that our work, our science is political. And the question would be like for the panel, if you think that we should address that more in our scientific output like that overfishing, for example, is a problem.
Okay, I think Jayne has something, she was like, she can share.
Yeah, so I think, there can be this inherent tension sometimes with the data outputs that we have, and how we frame those can create that tension. But we can also dissipate that in the way that we frame it and the way that we engage in conversations with stakeholders when it comes to these issues. So I would argue that in many ways, managers, scientists, and fishers want the same thing overall. The big goal is sustainable populations. Fishers want to be able to continue to support their livelihood, to put food on the table. They want their kids to be able to do that. And we want the same things, but sometimes when those management decisions come across as coming out of the blue, or they're perceived as being unfounded, or there's a conflict between what someone is observing in their day-to-day life. They're in an area where perhaps they're seeing a number of these fish, and other areas they're very low, and it feels like it's a punitive thing that's being done. And I think that's where those conversations are very important. I've seen great situations where when people are aware of what the issues are, everybody's advocating for things that you might not be expecting. So a good example, recently in Florida, we had a really horrific red tide event, 2017 to 2019. Particularly hard hit in the estuaries. So a lot of our big sport fish, which are a huge source of income for guides and recreational anglers, people come to Florida as tourists to go fishing for these species, and they were really decimated. And Florida Fish and Wildlife moved quickly to close two species. They closed redfish and they closed snook. And actually the guides were arguing, you need to close spotted sea trout. Like, we're not seeing any of them. This doesn't look good. We don't want these guys gone. And it was part of, because these conversations were happening, it was done in a way that was actually very well received. I mean, I don't think people were overall happy that a closure was needed, but they understood why, and were happy when that closure was able to be lifted. It was 1 to 2 years, depending on the species, down the road as those populations were rebounding. So I think it's important that we think about how we're framing this and how we're engaging with various stakeholders and thinking about their perspective in that conversation.
Thank you. Did anyone else have something to add? Yeah.
Yeah, I think I can add to that. I'm not speaking from my point of view, but actually there was a really close friend of mine who involved a lot in the policymaking discussions, especially on the international sphere. That her name is Anna, so she involved with CITES, and also Kerstin's friend. She involved with CITES and also IUCN meeting to kind of change the status of, especially sharks and rays in the Philippines. And she mentioned that sometimes the data itself becomes totally useless when it comes to the political will of the government. So when she was involved in the country meeting, the government knows that, the data are there, the populations are declining, and then, it's in the great danger if you're not protecting them. But sometimes they just, completely dismiss it because it's not the interest of the government. But I think also from Indonesia perspective, that shark fisheries is a very important economic sources, and it's a populous country. So unless you are accommodating the needs of millions of people in the country, especially on the shark fisheries, the government will not take decisions that is on the shark side, because it's not going to be good with the community and the people who are depending on them. So I think Jayne bringing a good point that the data can be very important sometimes, but you have to strategically frame it so that it could be an interest of the government. And especially, I think you have to kind of balance it with other informations. Like in my case, yes, we have the data on Thresher sharks, but at the same time, like the government won't listen to us unless we are giving an alternative livelihoods to the people. If we want, to protect them, we present the data. This is the data. This is the informations. What you can do. What's the decision you can make? But they say like, oh, we cannot do that unless you're giving these people an alternative sources of incomes, and then we will take the decisions. That's when they start to pay attention to data. So I think, strategically frame your data and then couple it with other informations, and eventually making extra effort to increase that willingness from the government. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Oh, Darren?
Yeah, so try to be brief on this one. Politics can only influence this so much. The minister has discretion under the Fisheries Act, but she also has other factors she must consider in our country, Canada. And we have extremely good legislation and extremely good frameworks put in place. They're just not understood well by other people other than DFO managers. We just had a manager stand up and tell everybody what they need to do. I heard them very clearly, and I hope everybody else did. The communication from science and academics and or people trying to move policy is coming from their understanding only. They don't understand the system they're feeding into. So for me as a fisher, I just didn't understand academics. I understand the framework of my government, because in order to be effective and to prevent overfishing and prevent other things from harming fish besides fishing, which is much more challenging, and I'd like to challenge people in the room to look beyond what's easy. You know, the minister has in Canada a factor she shall consider, which is Indigenous knowledge as well. So if the Indigenous people stand up and they present to the minister their knowledge, she has to somehow justify political, how she has to find a way to justify politically how she is going to circumvent that, which is extremely difficult, not only scientifically, publicly. So she has other factors as well as science, best available science, I believe it's worded as. In order for her to use politics, if it's presented properly by the scientists in the proper fashion to the managers, as was stated earlier, that's a very big undertaking for her, because she has a precautionary approach, she has to apply precaution, and that's been developed in a framework by the Privy Council of Canada. As well, it's been negotiated and agreed upon internationally for trade agreements. This is big stuff. So if you understand the arena that you work in, which most people don't, they understand their own system. For the minute, if you can navigate and make it so that there isn't these oversteps and things can be managed better, but you have to understand your toolbox that is put before you, and that is our Constitution, our legislation, and our frameworks. And therefore, politics can certainly influence, as they should in some cases, because that is part of the equation. We elect officials supposedly to look after things, but they have to also follow precaution and science and not local knowledge, Indigenous knowledge and other factors. So, I mean, we have a great system. We have to learn to, people need to educate themselves beyond their own understanding. And that would be my answer to it. Thank you.
Thanks, Darren. That's a great point. And we actually have empirical evidence. During my PhD, we analyzed over 200 case studies of fish telemetry tracking research. And one of the most influential factors that came out as something that was that would help, I guess, the likelihood of success of that study to change policy or practice was the familiarity of the PIs in the context of management or the context of policy. So that actually resonated well. Thank you, Darren. Kerstin, did you want to add anything or?
I know, I think that my fellow panelists done a really good job. Yeah, I just think that as you were mentioning previously, Rafid, in terms of political will, like what we found was getting that opportunity. At the end, we're all human beings, right? And as Jayne was mentioning, we all want everything what is best for humankind and well-being, you know, in the future generations. So I think that one thing that happened to be like on a very kind of like human component was trying to find that human connection with the people. It's not an institutional thing. It's like, how can you find this human connection with the managers, with the policymakers, and just making them feel proud. At the end of the day, what somebody wants is to go home and to feel that they're doing something that's good for their community and that they feel proud. And for us, in the case of the mantas, for example, it was really kind of like it became a flagship. And you could even see how mantas were, you know, before disregarded, and then they became as a source of pride for the institutions. You would see, you know, now you go to Peru and when, you know, people talk about marine biodiversity, you have this huge giant manta, you know, in one of the signs. And so I think that at the end of the day, beyond politics, it's getting that source of pride for institutions, for people, and definitely incorporating, as Rafid was mentioning as well, this these alternatives, right? Because it's not just about developing a policy or developing a management strategy, but it's if there are any sort of like offsets, how are you going to manage that with the communities? We've been working with ecotourism as well, and with Giant Manta ecotourism, and it's really kind of like looking at things at a more comprehensive way. It's not just everything about politics for me. It's goes beyond that, I think.
Great, thank you. So I'm going to pause questions for now, and we can get back to it. So I remember as a student, there's always these broad statements of like, you should do this, what are the best practices? So the next question, I'm going to challenge the panelists to give us something we can ground some of these best practices on. So I want you to pick, I know in our question says, what are some challenges, but could you pick one challenge that you faced when it came to navigating the policy sphere? But in addition to that, how did you overcome that challenge from your experience? I think this is important for young scientists to know, like what were those concrete steps and examples? Darren, you're the lucky one to start.
Nail it down to one is extremely difficult. There's so many. And to say that it's overcome, I would say it's being worked on. A place at the table. I mean, almost every room I'm in across this country, regardless of what room it is, I'm the only fisher, usually, unless there's an indigenous fisher there. Non-indigenous fisher, I'm likely the only one at every forum that I'm part of, and that is troubling. So I've got my way in the door, and it's not just because it's not a one-sided thing. It's the fact that fishermen don't understand the rooms. They don't understand the rooms exist. They don't understand the people in the rooms, and they don't put in the effort to get in the room because they're so concentrated on surviving themselves. And there's nothing, I'm not putting them down. I'm just saying that it's not an easy process. I have dedicated my life to kicking the door in to get into the room because I want to save the ecosystem that I work in and the animals that live within it and the people that live within it. I live in that ecosystem. I do 500 shifts this year in the water. As soon as this is done, in 5 minutes time or 10 minutes time, I'll be leaving my house and I'll go out there in that water and I'll be with those fish. And I love it. I'm very connected. It's my place of worship, period. And people don't get that, right? And it's many fishermen's place of worship. When I talk about fishermen, I'm talking about independent small operators. I'm not talking about the giants, right? That consume and destroy. So for me, it's to get into the room and to stay in the room. And I've got into the room and I'm staying in the room. I've been many attempts to take me into the room many times, but I'm not in every room because I'm only one person. And somehow we have to find a way to bring that set of knowledge. How could we ignore, besides arrogance, and I mean no offense to anybody here, I know I probably shouldn't say that because that probably means I do mean to offend, but at the end of the day, how do we exclude the human beings that live on the water, then locally understand the water, and sit around and pretend that we know what we're talking about? That's insanity to me. And that's what I see all over the place. But saying that, I recognize our side has major faults in that as well. We haven't found our way in to contribute positively to the success and future of the ocean. I think you get in the room. If I had to say one thing, it's I've got in the room. I just got to figure out how to make it so that other fishermen have an easier road to get into the room and be productive. And not just scream, not just conflict, but add content to the product. Does that make sense?
Yes, and I thank you so much for sharing that perspective, Darren. It's super important. It reminds me of when I was doing my master's and working with, I was doing interviews and working with anglers, and I really felt, I don't know, somehow guilty when they were like, oh, well, are you from here? Do you fish? Do you know the context? And then I felt like, no, I don't. And it really, yeah, there's this disconnect, and I think sharing that was amazing. Thank you. Jayne, can I go to you next?
Sure. So I think sort of following up on what Darren had to say, and this is not a challenge that I had to overcome because somebody had already figured out a great way to do this. But I'll offer up this example maybe as sort of inspiration to others in the room. But that problem was sort of tackled where I am in Sarasota by an organization called Florida Sea Grant. Sea Grant exists nationally in the US. So for other American folks in the room, if you're not in connection with your local Sea Grant folks, it's a great way to start making those connections with fishers in your community, because that is largely what they do. And so they had set up a forum locally in Sarasota called the Sarasota Bay Fisheries Forum. And it meets every other month. It's a time when people come together to talk about common concerns facing the Sarasota Bay ecosystem and the fish in that ecosystem. And it's everybody there. It is fishery managers, it's scientists, it's fishers and angling guides, charter guides, commercial fishers are there sometimes as well. It's even neighbors, just people who live on Sarasota Bay who are troubled by, just everything from water quality to what they are perceiving, what they are seeing in terms of environmental change that's happening over the years with mangroves being cut down, with frequent red tide events. So people are coming together, and then all these little sub-interest groups have formed to tackle some of the issues of habitat and how can we encourage planting of mangroves? How can we encourage natural shorelines and living seawalls, because so much of Sarasota Bay has been hardened into seawalls. So it's this great opportunity for people to come together. And it's actually in my prior example of the red tide event and anglers calling for an additional species to be closed. This is where their voices were heard by managers. This is where that connection was formed, and that input was valued and factored into that decision making. So those kinds of things, if you can build something like that in your local community, it is a great way for people to come together, and you hear all kinds of perspectives on all kinds of issues. And I think it really does help find some bigger and better solutions to some of the challenges we're facing.
Thank you. Rafid, do you have a challenge and then a solution to your challenge?
Yeah, I think when you mentioned about being a student, and then I can speak as a young person fighting a lot with imposter syndrome and not believing in yourself. And I think eventually, like before I came here, I got a call from my team in the field saying that, oh, there was a protest from the fishers. They wanted the policy to be lifted up, and they want the sharks to be able to be fished again and all that. It was really frustrating. I think it's kind of like a very common situations in the field, especially when you're dealing a lot with the community. And it's it could be a really hard situations when sometimes like, oh, all I did has to stuck somewhere that the government are not supportive or the community are backlashing with our intention. But I think that the navigating those challenges, sometimes it's the thoughts of like, oh, maybe I should give up, maybe I should work somewhere else, like with less but then with less challenge. And I think having a mentor, especially like Kerstin, and I have a mentor named Anna, and my other folks that I considered mentors, that it's eventually like if you work in conservation and the interface between the science and how to make science, the marine science, ecology, conservation, and community, it's very common to have that disagreements between the knowledge and between the practice of the people, and you don't have to really feel desperate with that. Eventually it will, pass down, and you just have to really believe that what you do is actually making a difference, in no matter how small it is. And it really helps me a lot. And by being a group of people that really encourage me, and I think it's slowly getting better. And I think it helps me to build more empathy, understanding from so many sides. From the government side, I understand like, oh, they don't interested because this is what they think. From the fisherman side, I develop an empathy that, you know, I don't want to hurt their livelihoods. I don't want, because some of them have small kids, you know, and they live in very poor condition. And, you know, I don't want to be that person who really destroy a life, you know. And I think it's sometimes conflicting, like, oh, maybe we should allow them to fish the sharks, but at the same time, you know, you want otherwise. And I think, yeah, I mean, it's all challenging, but by being with the right person, and then it helps you to build more empathy and more understanding that what you did is worth it. So it's just part of the growth, and you know, it's kind of like a ladder of your career moving forward. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you. And Kerstin, do you have any?
Yeah, I mean, talking about ladders, I think that for me, it's been recognizing and acknowledging and kind of that it is a step-by-step process, and that it's a long-term process. And so I think that one of our main challenges is the fact that we're a very small nonprofit. We had talked about this yesterday with Rafid, right? And many of these things require, you know, years of commitment and a lot of resources, human resources, financial resources. And coming from a small nonprofit in a low-income country or in a middle-income country, it sometimes is extremely difficult to get these resources and be able to continue your work long-term. So for us, for example, we started, you know, with the giant mantas or with the sawfish, and right now, you know, that is just kind of like our initial point. Like getting the policy is not the overall outcome. Like there's so much more things that you need to do after that policy is set, right? So in the case of getting mantas legally protected, okay, we got that, but of course you need to make sure that the enforcement is in place. And of course, it's not just about getting the mantas legally protected. There's a huge issue in terms of bycatch, right? And so how are we going to solve that bycatch issue? And with our like satellite telemetry work, we've seen that mantas are more, for example, more at the surface, and that makes them more vulnerable to interacting with gill nets in the region. So we've been setting out to work with the government to develop, you know, kind of like strategies to reduce that bycatch, and developing workshops to bring people together. For the sawfish work, for example, we got sawfish legally protected, but what else, right? So now we're working with governments like with the CIMAR, or, you know, in Peru as well. And we're starting to build a regional strategy for sawfish. So recognizing that, you know, that policy is not the end point, and that you're in there for the long haul. And as was said yesterday, many times funding mechanisms are for specific projects for a specific timeline, and then that funding ends and that you need to start again, right, to continue working. So for us, that's been a challenge. But I think that just having like clear goals, set clear milestones, and also working on those relationships throughout the way, I think helps you move forward on that ladder. But it's definitely challenging. And like, I've thought of that a million times, what you're saying, like, why don't I, you know, just get rid of this and go, you know, do my own like convenience store or something. But the passion is what takes you there, I think, and what leads you to the next step in the ladder.
So can I pose a follow-up question? How do you keep that flame going? It gets pretty hard sometimes. And does anyone have like a trick or a
I mean, I'm still learning. So I think that, yes, at the end, it's kind of like recognizing, you know, like who you are as a person, I guess. Like for me, like I live next to the ocean. I just go and take time for myself. Like I have a 9-year-old daughter too. So like just going back into that core self and recognizing that maybe you take one step back, but then you're moving 3 steps ahead. So it's, yeah, but it is challenging. And recognizing that you're not the only one with a challenge, right? When I first started, I was like, and my friends would say like, this only happens to you, you know? And I'm like, oh my goodness. But then you recognize that everybody has those challenges, right? And so you're just part of this community.
Yeah, I think if I may add to that, I think there was actually a previous interview questions when I applied for a grant, like what really keeps you going. I think that it's really back to the human connection that Kerstin mentioned. So I was not that 100% involved in the field because I have some of my local staff that I was able to employ. And one of them actually sent the video of a fisherman who now transitioned from shark fishing into tuna fishing in more sustainable way. So he used 1-by-1 handline fisheries, and we were able to support him with the with the new boats and then the new machines, and eventually connecting him to a new supply chain so he could get a better value on the tuna, especially with selling it international market. And he was sending a video that said, oh, right now after I stopped shark fishing after 1 year, I was able to pay the school fees for my children. My daughter is now able to go to high school. And it's really like when I saw that video, like I was tearing up a bit, like it was really heartwarming. And it really makes me forget like all of those challenges that, a protest from the other fishermen, that kind of like imposter syndrome make me want to stop. But seeing that one testimonial from the fishermen that we're working with, it really makes me see that, oh, really what I do from the acoustic, it eventually leads to policy and alternative livelihoods and all that, makes a difference in someone's life. And it's not a bad thing, but it's something that actually can help them to move forward into something better. So
it's like celebrating those small
yeah,
successes, right? Like
yeah.
this fisherman that I mentioned that had lifted the manta with a crane, like he went on to also get into manta ecotourism. And so you kind of see that those just tiny things are, I think, what take you from one step to the other, right?
Yeah, I think that's really helps to makes you more optimist.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, because sometimes you can be overwhelmed by thinking, I got to change the policy, I need to do all this, but the little wins are really important. I think we have less than 10 minutes. I want to open it up to the audience again to see if anyone wanted to follow up on any of the comments, reflections, if you had questions.
Hi, my name is Matthew Warner. I'm a master's student at Acadia studying lake trout here in Nova Scotia. So I understand that this would be a question. So I understand that, like I think doing science for the sake of science is very important. But I believe like even more important is doing science to affect policy. Because I think someone said like, we're all very passionate about this field like you guys are. But, sometimes one of these, I guess like science for the sake of science studies, let's say like looking at courtship behavior of an animal or like regional color differences or something, maybe like that can affect policy or conservation later. But where do you think that like kind of indirect to policy science kind of fits in with this, with eventually, maybe getting used for policy or not?
Mm-hmm.
That's a great question.
Yeah,
Anyone?
I think I can give a very good example on that. So my advisor, his name is Mark Erdman. So he's a writer of Indo-Pacific Fish. So he did a lot of discovery of deep fish that only the size of your nail, so very small. And one time he was actually working in the MPA project, the Marine Protected Area project in West Papua. And he did a lot of, reef surveys, eventually like documenting some of the fishes because West Papua is mega biodiverse, but not a lot of information about it. And then he actually found a very small fish that it's in the size of fingernails, associated with reefs around the coastal areas of one village that he's been working with. It's if you can see that, I mean, like who would care about such a small fish? But it turns out the fish is actually endemic to the village, and it's found nowhere else. And then he was actually advocating that information and give the new species name to the indigenous leader of the community. And then it really gives the pride of the indigenous leader and the government there that, oh, this fish is with my name now. And, it's really give the drive of, the policy interface, like, oh, let's protect this area so the fish could survive, and then I think that's one of the good example, even if like you're not working in, but I think it's a very specific example, but I think, it's even if you're not working with a charismatic species or you work on a very specific science that is not related directly to science policy. I think you could use that kind of entry point, engaging the people, make them interested with the species, why it's important, so that people could really pay attention to that. Yeah.
Thank you.
And I just, oh, go ahead. I mean, I think that everything kind of like fits within the jigsaw puzzle, right? So a lot of times when you're developing a policy document, or you need to have, all this like scientific literature, background information, you need many of these pieces that maybe initially might not have been as relevant, but that are, because they come in together in this more comprehensive way. Particularly on my side, like our work is more focused on that, looking at the problem and trying to identify some of the solution. That's what we find relevant. But of course, you recognize that there's, a lot of science out there that does fit into this jigsaw puzzle. I think that the most important thing, and kind of like thinking about yesterday, Elder Albert that was talking about transformative change and systems change. So I think that one thing that's really important is looking at this overarching, what are our issues? What are our problems? And just if there is this science, like, how does that fit within the jigsaw puzzle? Because even though it might be indirect, it might contribute, might be one of those tiny little pieces. But yeah, looking at the big picture first, I think, and how that fits in.
And Jayne, did you want to add? Sure. So I think we often think about sort of basic science and applied science as being two different fields that kind of intersect in the middle a little bit, if you can picture a Venn diagram, but very often someone is driven by one or the other. And I would argue, I think we need to be driven by both sides of it. And there's an interplay between it as well, right? So you may be trying to address a particular management challenge. You may be trying to provide information that you think is needed for that particular challenge. But I have a colleague who's very famous for saying, we don't know what we don't know. Right. And if you're not continuing to chase that curiosity as well, and just trying to, understand some basic things as well, where you may not see an immediate sort of applied use for those data, there are a lot of things I think we could miss. And so chasing both, I think, is very important. And it also opens up more funding opportunities. So that doesn't hurt. But just staying open-minded in both directions, looking, when you're thinking about, okay, this is some very basic research that I'm doing. I'm focused on the why. Why does this work this way? How does this work? Some of those types of questions. Stay open to the how can we apply it, and vice versa. When you're working on applied things, keep your eyes open, keep thinking, keep questioning, keep that, childlike curiosity that brought all of us into the science in the first place.
And Darren, did you have anything to add from your perspective?
Well, I think Matt knows who I am and he can ask me anytime. So I'd like to get to question 4. We only got 5 minutes left, so I'm going to leave this one alone because I'm long-winded.
Yeah, I think we're at -2 minutes now. Well, I thank you everyone for sharing your stories, your experiences, your lessons learned. I think there's lots of themes that we've been taking away from some of our panels. One was about voice, some about, us all being human. So if you just take down those boundaries of science versus policy, or, community versus academia, I think in the end, what I'm hearing is that we're all humans. And I think yesterday, the elder who opened the ceremony, our symposium, she said to speak from the heart. So I think that's super important. So everyone, if you can join me in giving an applause to our panel.